This is the 415ers podcast brought to you by the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network with 95.7 The Game. Please listen, rate, and subscribe in the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcast from. That is Mark Grandi. I'm Evan Giddings. The 49ers using 11 picks to make 9 selections in the 2023 NFL Draft. We talked about their third rounders. They go for a safety. They go for a kicker. They go for a tight end. They do not go for an offensive lineman. And, if we're just kind of thinking about, all right, what did they try to address in this draft? I do feel like there was a lot of best availability involved in pretty much the majority of this because you can, I think, afford to get a little risque when you're bringing back the majority of a team that was in the Final Four and was maybe a quarterback injury away from making the Final Two. So to me, I've seen a lot of questioning and kind of, I guess, perplexed analysis about where the 49ers chose to go with this draft, Mark. And I do understand. Um, and I don't want to say by any means the 49ers are playing with house money at this point, but I think that if you're looking at, okay, you're taking 2 tight ends essentially for 1 backup tight end spot. You're taking a safety along with a couple of hybrid linebackers, smaller linebackers that can play in the box, but could also potentially play who knows, kind of a more physical safety position, late round wide receiver who's kind of a bigger target, a la Juwan Jennings. I feel like the 49ers chose to sort of sprinkle things around as opposed to address areas of need. If you want to critique that, I understand. But I also feel like the 49ers, for whatever reason, feel very confident with the roster that they have right now, even at the positions of need. And this draft reflects that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you see a lot of, I think the majority of this draft, and this is, I think, what you try to go for when you have later round guys. I don't know if project is the right word. That's kind of what we use more for NBA draft picks. But it seems like the mold the 49ers are going for here, and there are a handful of guys, at least a couple of guys, who I think will have relatively large impact on this coming year. One of them is the kicker, Jake Moody, because we expect him to be the starter, and he'll probably lead the team in points this year because that's just what kickers do. But beyond that, we could get into it. A couple of players who I think will play, offensive or defensive snaps for most of the games of the regular season, assuming health, more than just special teams. But for the most part, I think the majority of this draft class are guys who the 49ers are trying to think about stash for a year or two, and then you hope you get a return on their potential. You're drafting guys that have some good physical characteristics, some good physical traits, but maybe aren't quite ready from a, I don't know if knowledge is the right word, but from an understanding of the game of football to make an impact on this 49ers team just yet. And the Niners are in this weird situation where, of course, you want to continue to add quality players who are going to impact winning right away. But they're also at a position where they just don't have a ton of open snaps left. It's just the reality of what it is. You have so much talent everywhere. It's kind of hard to not want to plan for the future a little bit. But if you go out and admit, yeah, this is Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch. Yeah, we're thinking about 2025 with this draft class. Like, you're never going to say that because football teams can always use more help now. But it kind of seems to me, Evan, like this is a draft where the 49ers aren't going to hear a ton from most of these draft picks this year. And that's the reality when you don't have a ton of high picks anyway. But their hope is that a year or two down the road, you'll see 2, 3, 4 starters from this group of 9 that kind of come out of nowhere, similar to how a Hufanga came out of nowhere years prior, how a Dre Greenlaw came out of nowhere, how a Deebo Samuel came out of nowhere, how a George Kittle came out of nowhere. I think that's where they're hoping this draft helps them out. Of course, they want the help now, but I think what their plan is they will get a boost from this group in a year or 2 or 3 down the road.
No, I think that's a good point. And I also think that a lot of these players are in kind of 49er specific molds. And look, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But we're talking about Jair Brown, a guy that fits in a mold along with a potential path of a Talanoa Hufanga. You're looking at, a guy like Robert Beal Jr. towards the edge who fits in as far as a speed rusher. He's not the biggest guy, and you're not going to get, obviously, a full-blown amazing talent at pick 173, but you're going to get, a guy that can potentially compete for snaps on the outside. D. Winters runs a 4.5 as a linebacker. It kind of fits in that Demetrius Flanagan Fowles sort of mold. You're looking at John Graham as a linebacker from Purdue, also sort of smaller, faster. These are later round picks, but I mean, a guy like Fred Warner was not perceived as a big bruising linebacker when he came into the league. I know he was a third-round pick as opposed to a fifth or a seventh, but there are guys in this draft that they selected that I feel like ideally project to be the next kind of wave of the current iteration of some of these players, have similar physical traits to a lot of these guys. Obviously, the mental makeup is a huge part of what the 49ers are, specifically defensively, but also on offense. But you're seeing, I think, a lot of draftees this year that could potentially, sort of fit into the 49ers system more seamlessly. And that's why, even though they may be perceived as sort of projects, I feel like they are developmental players that are fit more so for this system. And that's something that I think a lot of teams in the NFL will not exactly value. You're trying to get best available talent. You're trying to get certain guys, but you need people that fit into your system. And the 49ers system has obviously been very successful under Kyle Shanahan. And I think being able to go out and get a couple of these players on both sides of the football, even if they're not at areas of need, such as, right tackle in the trenches, they also do fit in my mind, I think, with what the 49ers envision for this team and potentially in the future.
Yeah, I think one of the guys that kind of fits the 49ers, mold of a player is tight end Cameron Latu, who they picked in the third round, 101 overall, just a couple of picks after they picked Jake Moody, the kicker from Michigan. He's out of Alabama, the tight end Cameron Latu is. I think the Niners are interested in him because he started his career at Alabama, believe it or not, as a pass rusher, and he was pretty good with the Crimson Tide as a pass rusher. But they switched him to tight end in 2019. And, he didn't have record-breaking numbers and wasn't, the star of that offense. Of course, they had so many good weapons through his career at Alabama. But, he was involved in the offense on a relatively consistent basis. He also suffered a foot injury just before his final year, but he seems good to go now. But what stands out most for him is that he's a really good blocker. Already. And it seems to me, Evan, like he has a step up in the backup tight end spot. I mean, you consider who the 49ers have there right now. Charlie Warner and Ross Dwelley. Warner, pretty good blocker. Ross Dwelley, not a very good blocker. Warner, not a very good pass catcher. Dwelley, a pretty good pass catcher. You have kind of guys that specialize in one thing. Latu, I think, can challenge Warner in terms of his blocking ability and can challenge Dwelley in terms of his pass catching ability. So I think he automatically, Evan, becomes the 49ers' second most talented tight end on this roster. And because he's relatively new to the position, Evan, I think the 49ers believe there is room for growth for him at the tight end spot. It's like, a player, in the NBA who you hear about this all the time, like Joel Embiid, who didn't pick up a basketball until what? He was like 14 or 15 years old. And, Jonathan Kuminga for the Warriors is a similar story. They picked up the game so late into their lives, at least compared to a lot of, their fellow players and teammates, that you expect them to be able to grow more than some of the players that they're competing against because they have been playing the game for longer. I think that's the mindset for the 49ers with Latu at tight end. Not only will I think he will have an impact this year as the 49ers' second tight end, and we know they use a lot of two tight end sets, but I think the 49ers believe strongly that he has a lot of improvement ahead of him and potentially at a pretty quick rate early in his career.
Yeah, and I think his numbers kind of reflect, a guy like George Kittle coming out of college. There was, I know, some parallels made between them. And interestingly enough, so they technically took two tight ends, but to your point about trying to find sort of similarities. Latu being probably a better blocker than Braden Willis, but according to John Lynch, Willis out of Oklahoma is a guy that also played some H-back, played fullback. And so potentially, you're seeing a guy who could be more along the lines of a Kyle Juszczyk, who's versatile and is not going to be a pure tight end.